Thank you so much. I'm super excited to have the opportunity to chat with folks across the country today as we are talking about a coordinated community response to stalking, to the crime of stalking. My name is Natalie Ivy. I work with the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. We're an agency, if you're not familiar with us, that is federally funded to provide trainings just like this. We can do those trainings virtually, we can do those in person. We also are here to provide technical support. That might be resources, it might be technical assistance about a specific case. So we are really kind of the takeaway, hopefully for you on the call here today, is that we are here to help you and to ultimately, hopefully, reduce the lift and the load of the work that you do, because we know that folks in the field have a lot of responsibility and are carrying a lot at one time. So we want to help support you in the best way that we can. That being said, though we are federally funded, it does not mean that our presentation here today, nor the conversation that we might have about the work that we do, that those necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice. So that is our housekeeping on the front end before we jump into this content today. I do want to highlight, as we talk about some of the resources, we're going to be talking quite a bit about resources that we have available for different partners in our community. You can find all of those on our site. So stalkingawareness.org, you can scan that QR code. That's not a trick for us to try to steal anybody's identity. That hopefully will be a quick little shortcut for you so you can go and access those things. And again, we want to make these accessible. We want to make them practical and helpful for you. But you're going to hear me reference some of these resources quite a bit as we talk about equipping our community and our partners in the work that we do relative to responding to stalking. So one little plug here, I will say, we are incredibly close to breaking the 7,000 followers mark on our Instagram account. So if you can go to Follow Us Legally, that is our handle on Instagram, and give us a follow, my colleagues will be so proud of me. So you'll put a little feather in my cap if you can do that for us today. It's also a really great way to stay up to date on new resources that we have rolling out and learning about what's available, and hopefully, again, helping support you in the work that you do. So why are we having an entire conversation about a coordinated community response to stalking? One of the reasons why this is so important, the first reason is somewhat obvious. If you have been in the field working with victims of crime, particularly working with victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, you inherently know the value of a community response, right? We understand and we have an appreciation for how complex these dynamics, these forms of abuse can be, and how much support it really requires from the community at large for us to successfully respond to these behaviors and create meaningful impact in our community. All of those things are true with stalking, and I would say compounded by the fact that stalking is an incredibly difficult form of abuse to recognize. And it's one that maybe doesn't receive the same level of impetus or focus, structure, protocol, policy, right, that we might have within our agencies for those other types of crime. And those responses are great. We need to have heightened responses for domestic violence, for sexual violence, for human trafficking. But we really need to be thinking about stalking in the same way that we have a heightened, we have a, predetermined response as a community to this crime, but also really thinking about the unique way that stalking shows up. So what we see when we are looking at stalking behaviors as a whole, we inherently kind of have this trickle-down effect. And that's kind of my, informal way of describing what happens when individuals are experiencing stalking versus the way that it is formally showing up in our systems. We see inherently a trickle-down effect within victim services, within our prosecution, the charges that we are formally charging and pursuing. We see this trickle-down effect within law enforcement, the reports that we're receiving versus what is actually charged or what is highlighted within those reports. And so we kind of have to recognize this data and these statistics are an indicator to us as a community that we need to kind of do our own assessment, our own audit. Are we kind of contributing to, or do we have areas where we might have a trickle-down effect within our community? Maybe you don't, but I'm going to guess that there's probably some areas that we could be shoring up and really making sure that we're identifying all of the parts of the process, all of the forms of relief that a victim could be seeking to make sure that we are not contributing to a trickle-down effect where we don't have victims reporting, we don't have victims reaching out for support and for help, and either being overlooked, being minimized, or just the stalking element not being recognized. So before we kind of jump into some of this nuance, let's make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about stalking and what this actually is. And oftentimes when we're doing kind of our bigger presentations, we'll kind of dive into some of the misconceptions and misunderstandings about stalking. We see there are a lot of contributing factors to that. But I just want to highlight that first and foremost, that when we are talking about as a community getting on the same page about stalking, this is not ever bringing a new concept to your community. Oh my gosh, have you heard of this word stalking? Let me tell you what it is. What you will be doing is battling misconceptions, right? People have a misunderstanding. They are misguided oftentimes in what this actually is and the impact that it can have on our community. So we won't go into a ton of detail with that today. If you're interested in that, you can jump on some of our other trainings that we have archived on our site. But I just want us to be aware of that, right? And that kind of learning curve, that battle is going to be there for us, whether it is engaging other community partners or engaging the public at large, right? That we need to be able to address some of these misconceptions head on and really talk about stalking accurately and honestly when we talk about how this is showing up and how this is impacting victims in our community. So I'll put a little plug out there. Obviously, this is a widespread training, so we can't do a deep dive into all of the statutes, but it's important for us to know that this is a behavior that is defined as a crime on a federal level in all 50 states, in DC, in the US territories, in most of our tribal codes, and within the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And if you're a little bit of a legal nerd like me, you might want to click into those statutes and see what they are, right? First and foremost, you might be interested about your own jurisdiction statutes. And this is an interactive map that lives on our site. You can go and check out those statutes. You can check out neighboring jurisdictions if you're curious about that. Maybe you want to see how the federal government defines stalking as a crime. But it's a really easy way to do quick compare and contrast if you're interested in some of the statutory definitions. So the reason we can't dig into all the statutes is because if you're familiar with criminal statutes, you know that every jurisdiction likes to define and structure their statutes a little bit differently from their neighbors, right? And so we have kind of a varying definition from a criminal legal perspective when we look at those statutes. But when we talk about the behavioral definition of stalking, this is kind of becomes our universal language. And this is really what's important when we talk more about a holistic response to victims of crime, when we talk more about actually being aware of the crime in our community. We might not always be able to go down a criminal legal route anyway. That might not be an option for whatever reason. It really should not inhibit, the criminal legal definition should not inhibit our ability, no matter what role we're in, inhibit our ability to recognize when stalking is occurring and when this form of abuse is being utilized. So when we talk about this behavioral definition, we talk about a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. It doesn't look overly complicated on the surface, right? But this definition really kind of encapsulates all of the reasons why we have to have a coordinated community response to be able to adequately respond to stalking. So let me just highlight a couple things to just, maybe you can start thinking about your own communities, your own partners, your own responses, right? And again, doing some of those internal audits to see if there are gaps in the system for someone who is in your community experiencing this. First and foremost, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, is this pattern of behavior. For stalking to be identified and to be recognized, we have to oftentimes have more than one event, right? I cannot think of a single stalking statute that relies on a single event. It almost always is two or more events. And the statutes is oftentimes called course of conduct. That's not a complicated concept, But it is difficult for our systems to identify because our systems, if you think about them in general, are incident respondent, right? We are calling 911 because of an incident. Law enforcement is responding to an incident. A victim may be coming to us for emergency housing because of an incident, right? Someone might be seeking medical care because of an incident. We are designed to be that way, to be incident respondent, to be triaging the emergency or, the event that is bringing this person to our door. And so what happens is if we have incident responding lenses on as we are engaging victims of stalking, we might respond to them and we might triage that emergency and we might support them and we might, address the event that brought them to our door. But if that victim in the middle of their trauma doesn't tell us as responders, oh, by the way, this single event that is, ruining my life tonight also is part of a course of conduct. Here are the other things that have occurred, and here's the evidence I have to show you that those things have occurred, right? If the victim doesn't do that, which I think we can all acknowledge, that's a heavy lift for an individual who is in active crisis. If they don't do that, then we as responders engage with them. We, do our part. We hand them off. We, wrap up the case. And we say, well, gosh, it wasn't stalking because they never told us about anything else, right? We're waiting for it to come to the surface. And if it doesn't, we feel like we're kind of internalize that is validation that stalking wasn't occurring. So we really want to think about flipping that script and that responsibility. And again, this is why it's so important to be having these community conversations, because as we'll discuss today, everybody in their unique role gets the opportunity to intersect victims at different stages of stalking. And so we want to make sure all of our partners are equipped to look beyond the incident respondent lens, right? To be asking about a course of conduct, to be asking about other behaviors, to kind of, I oftentimes say, if you're a responder, you want to prove to yourself it's not stalking rather than waiting for the victim to prove to you that it is. And that will really open up our lens as we are screening for stalking and trying to identify it within the folks that we're working with. All right, so the second part of this definition that can really kind of cause a hiccup is the kind of impact that the stalking behavior has to have that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others or suffer substantial emotional distress. So if you have been to law school, you know all about the reasonable person, right? That becomes your best friend for a couple of years of your life. But a lot of us, that might not translate. What does that really mean? How are we supposed to interpret that? Who is a reasonable person? That's a fair question, right? But what we are saying when we are talking about this reasonable person standard is that we are looking at the impact of the behavior from the perspective of the victim. And we're saying, yeah, this does cause harm, right? This does cause fear. This does cause substantial emotional distress. So the reasonable person standard kind of separates this behavior from behavior that is less serious, right? But sometimes it causes us, when we lack context, when we lack perspective from the victim, it causes us to fail to see stalking. I'll use a really quick example, but if we had a victim who maybe in the kind of the middle of a really abusive relationship, if things were getting incredibly violent, maybe the abuser told the victim, I'm going to kill you one day and I'm going to put a dozen white roses on your grave, right? That was a common threat that this victim heard, and they heard it while they were in the middle of experiencing extreme physical assaults. Maybe that victim flees that relationship, has started a new relationship somewhere, our new life, is living safely and independently, and walks into work on their first day of work and there's a dozen white roses on their desk. The context, right? The reasonable person standard is the difference between what everyone else in the office will be doing about that flower delivery versus what that victim's experiencing. Because for everyone else who sees a flower delivery, they are probably going to be, fawning over it. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. You're so lucky. I wish someone would do that for me. What the victim is experiencing is a very real and tangible threat, right? I know where you are. I'm coming to find you. I'm going to hurt you. That's that kind of spectrum there is an illustration of the reasonable person standard. If we lack the victim's context, what they've experienced, what they've been through, then it makes it really hard for us to understand why flower deliveries can be threatening. But if we have context, we as outsiders can say, oh, this is a form of a death threat, right? This is a form of abuse, and we can recognize what is actually happening in that moment. So when we talk about these behavioral patterns within stalking, we really like to rely on the SLY framework, which was developed by a researcher that we partner with really closely, just because it kind of gives a broad perspective of all of the ways that stalking behaviors can play out, right? I want to walk through some of these so that we, no matter what your role is in your community, you can start to think about what stalking behaviors you might hear about, what type of disclosures you might hear, and or when your agency or your role is most likely to intercept a victim of stalking. Because as we're going to see, and these categories are not mutually exclusive, this list obviously is not exhaustive, but we're going to see this cycle kind of builds on itself, and it also becomes self-fueling to some degree. So when we talk about surveillance behaviors, we are talking about an abuser, an individual that is gathering information about the victim for the purpose of causing future harm. Now, you hear me emphasize that last part with my voice because so often we as a society, we describe gathering information as stalking, right? If you were dating in the dating world, right? You're about to go on a blind date, or maybe you're going on a first date with someone. You might do what you can to try to find information about that person. Are there any headlines with this person's name in it, right? Anything I should be aware of? Anything I should be paying attention to? That's not stalking. When you are gathering information for the purpose of causing future harm, you are engaging in surveillance stalking behaviors, right? This is where abusers and stalkers are gathering information about the victim, like their routine, where they park, what work shifts do they take, do they lock their back door, who are their friends and family, have they just moved to a new town, what classes do they take, right? They are gathering information for the purpose of causing future harm. So we want to think about these behaviors, all the ways that this can play out, and also keeping in mind, this gets real tricky for us as responders, there is a likelihood that an abuser can be engaging in surveillance behaviors, a stalker could be engaging in surveillance behaviors without the victim even knowing. So when we are engaging victims at later stages in the stalking dynamic, we might want to kind of back up and ask about some of these surveillance behaviors or the likelihood of surveillance behaviors in that victim's life. So our second category is life invasion. So this is really kind of where the stalker is saying, not only, am I going to learn about your life, now I'm going to be part of your life, whether you want me to be or not. So you think about in our own, maybe give our own personal perspective in your own life, if you've ever quit a job or ended a relationship, right? There's I'm assuming, a time in your life where you have said, you know what, this isn't serving me anymore. I'm going to go a different direction, right? And I think we all would like to know that we have the autonomy and the ability to do that. This is not serving me. I want to go a different direction. I don't really want to be exposed to this anymore. I don't want to be part of this, whatever the case might be. When we are talking about this life invasion behavior, it's essentially the stalker starting to exert that power and control over the victim by saying, I will be part of your life, whether you want me to be or not. Right? You don't have the ability to actually keep me out of your life. You're going to have to deal with me. You're going to have to think about me. You're going to have to see me because I'm going to be at your kid's baseball game. I'm going to be sitting on the park bench across from your office. I'm going to be at the grocery store when you're shopping. I'm going to be blowing up your phone. When you get up in the morning, you're going to have 132 missed calls from me in the night. I will be part of your life and you do not have the ability to keep me out. Right. So we see that individual starting to exert that power and control over the victim's life. And this next stage, this intimidation stage, is where they are increasing the amount of power and control that they are exerting over the victim, essentially by saying, not only will I be part of your life, but you should fear my presence. You should fear my presence because fill in the blank, right? The stalker at this point is saying, I can cause harm in your life. I can send those pictures or videos I have of you. I can get you fired from work. I can hurt you. I can hurt your family. I can hurt your pets, right? I can cause harm. I can cause consequence and impact in your life. So you should fear my presence. Because again, that kind of increases that power and the control that they have over the victim. And then this last stage is when the stalker causes harm. They have threatened to cause harm. I can hurt you. I can hurt your family. They cause harm. They do hurt. They engage in physical assault and sexual assault and professional sabotage, right? They create issues in the victim's life. They create real impact in the victim's life. They create real harm. And that's that final stage. And so you can kind of see how that cycle becomes self-fueling, because once that harm occurs, then when the stalker just threatens harm again, it has a heightened response from the victim, right? I know they have the ability to cause harm. So they recognize this ability, and it increases, again, that stalker's perception of the power and control that they might have over the victim. So as we've already discussed, when we talk about these behaviors, some of these behaviors may appear to be overtly criminal, right? A physical assault, a sexual assault, not that difficult for us to detect. But some of these behaviors are not overtly criminal. On the surface, sending flowers is not overtly criminal, right? Calling someone, texting someone, driving down the road, those are not overtly criminal behaviors. It requires context for us to see, oh, this is part of this life invasion, approach. Or they're sending a threat through these flowers. We have to have the context from the victim to really understand what's happening here and how this is impacting the victim. I see a quick question, and I'll try to stop and grab these as we go, but I may not be able to do that successfully as we go through because I can't read and talk at the same time. But I see someone asked, would swatting be considered a form of life invasion? That's a really great question. I mean, and like I said, it's not mutually exclusive. The way that we categorize these, absolutely. Swatting, if anybody on the call is not familiar with that, but that's essentially calling in a fake emergency to the police, to law enforcement, and that emergency might be at 3 a.m, and they're calling to law enforcement and says, hey, I know there's an active meth lab in the basement of victim's home, right? And there are children in the home. They might be calling into law enforcement and saying, hey, there's a domestic violence situation that's escalating at victim's home. Firearms are being used, right? They're calling these fake reports in that kind of results in law enforcement coming to the victim's home with a really heightened response. So absolutely, that's invasive of the victim's life. I would also argue too, though, oftentimes swatting results in harm, right? Because we have this heightened response, we have high alert, we have confusion when law enforcement is responding to these types of calls. It is not uncommon, unfortunately, for injuries to happen. And so that could be part of those threats. It could be part of that, intimidation factor. It could also be the interference, the actual harm. So that's a great question. And swatting is a really great example of, a type of stalking behavior that could kind of fall in multiple categories depending on how that plays out and how that impacts the victim. So when we talk about this context, we want to make sure we are getting the story, but also we hopefully are reducing the lift from the victim. We are building community partnerships so that when we have a stalking victim disclose and that victim is accessing multiple partners, that the partners have a way to communicate that victim's experience, to communicate that victim's context, so that every time the victim is accessing someone in our community, they're not starting from square one. No, you don't understand. The dozen white roses were not nice. That was a threat, right? They're not having to explain that every single time they're talking to one of our partners. So we need to be thinking through that kind of as a policy decision, how we want to increase that communication and partnership with the folks who are responding to these calls. So let's talk about the intersection of stalking survivors. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but we're going to see that certain agencies, certain roles might be intersecting victims of stalking at different stages in their stalking. And because of that, that might make it a little bit difficult for us to recognize the victimization as a whole. So quick reminder, that's what we just talked about, right? The SLY framework. We've got surveillance, we've got life invasion, we've got the intimidation stage, and we have interference. When we think about our coordinated community response, I'm going to hit on some common partners within our criminal legal system. I'm going to talk about partners in the civil legal system. I'm going to talk about our victim service agencies, right? But I really want you to think about your own community, your CCR, your partners should look as unique as your community does, right? Every community has its own approach, its own leaders, its own kind of routes through the system. Be really intentional about the folks who are at the table. Do they have the opportunity to be intersecting victims and to be making kind of impactful change with the way that you are working with victims in your community? So it might go beyond the folks that we're suggesting here. In fact, I hope it does. I hope it goes beyond. I hope you're pulling in, unique partners or folks who are in the field that might be unique to your community. So let's look at the criminal legal system first. We'll jump into law enforcement. When we talk about engaging victims of stalking, we oftentimes within our criminal legal side, we are engaging them at that interference stage. Harm has occurred, right? There has been a physical assault, a sexual assault, property damage, right? These are some examples of the ways that this interference stage can present within the criminal legal system. So, they might be coming to us, they might be calling 911, they might be engaging law enforcement because of the harm that is occurring without the awareness that harm is really part of that course of conduct, right? So when we think about, again, all of the ways that this might show up, this is important information to consider as maybe we're doing an informal audit within our own, assessment of our community and the way that we are responding to reports and to folks. But really, if you are thinking about doing any type of formal audit within like law enforcement or maybe the community as a whole, I think about a formal audit. An example of a formal audit is kind of a domestic violence fatality review, right? If you have a community who is looking at domestic violence fatalities and going back to see how this case played out and who in the community had opportunity for intervention, thinking through all of the ways that this can present. If you're doing an audit, you can't just go back and say, what were our stalking cases? You're going to have to think through all of the different types of crimes that might be labeled or named and really understanding if those are part of course of conduct or not. So within law enforcement, some things we really want to recommend are kind of making sure that we're adapting our policies and our approach, our procedure to looking for those stalking behaviors, looking for that course of conduct with essentially kind of any type of report, right? When we have that harassing behavior, when we have that indication of abusive behavior, and when I say abusive, I don't just mean within the realm of domestic violence abuse. I mean abusive in that, person v person type of behavior, that we are really taking a minute to consider if this could be part of that course of conduct. Really, again, trying to prove to ourselves that this singular moment of abuse was an isolated incident, right? I think about maybe the one that I can think of that would maybe go both ways most often is like property damage, right? You might have somebody calling in and saying, hey, my mailbox got destroyed. And that might be that there were some teenagers out one night. I don't know if teenagers still do that. That was something teenagers did in my very small country town, when I was growing up. But, teenagers that are out bashing mailboxes. And those might not be part of a course of conduct. And it might not even really be directed at that victim. It's just like random property damage. That is truly an isolated incident, right? As opposed to property damage that's meant to send a message. And when we have that type of behavior, the victim is going to have a good suspicion of who's done it and why they've done it. And so really kind of separating those two crimes out, making sure that we're looking at those with very specific lenses. So we have some recommendations on our site to look at or, to kind of consider as you are thinking about different roles within law enforcement and ways that we can improve our response to victims of stalking. I just always want to highlight our communications and dispatch folks. Sometimes we get overlooked when we are talking about response, when we're talking about screening, when we're talking about victim support. But these first points of contact can be so crucial for victims of stalking. We'll talk in just a bit, but what we see, unfortunately, across the board are victims. There's a large portion of our victim population relative to stalking that do not even report. And that's because they've already had a negative experience reporting to their social connections, right? Family or friends. They just haven't responded in a way that validated their experience or made them feel like, it was worth telling someone. So we want to make sure that with our communications and dispatch that they're prepared to do what they can to support victims, to listen, actively listen, and potentially be screening for stalking within their own role and their own responsibilities, but ways that we can help shore up that stage, certainly making sure that our communications and dispatch, would never be contributing to a lack of reporting or a lack of follow-up from the victim. When we talk to patrol, we really want to make sure that the folks in the field have our stalking lens on, right? When we are responding to those behaviors relative to abuse, relative to harassment, it's a really crucial opportunity for us to start to build an important relationship with that victim, that they are being seen, they are being heard. One of our case studies that we use oftentimes when we are training professionals in the field, the most valuable thing and the thing that really saved the survivor's life in that case study was a responding officer. He did a lot of things relative to his law enforcement, role. There were at moments he arrested, moments he issued a no trespass. He did all those things right. But what was really most impactful is that he made the victim feel heard and seen and believed. And because of that, she kept reaching out to him and she kept telling him the story, right? And so that way he was able to put those pieces of the puzzle together much more effectively. If he had not invested in that time and that approach with the victim, she would be less inclined and he wouldn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. It would be very difficult for him to understand and appreciate what's going on. When we talk about our law enforcement response, we also have some suggestions and some recommendations relative to reports about the stalking behavior, making sure that there are parts of this dynamic that we want to be including in the report, being intentional about what we are asking about, and including that articulation of the victim's fear can be incredibly helpful, really helping set us up for a successful prosecution should we be headed in that direction. But it also can be a really helpful insulation tactic for that victim. We do see some studies indicate that stalkers, when they are approached with a formal response to stop their behavior. So the study I'm thinking of is specific to an order of protection. But essentially in that study, they said, there were certain stalkers that said, hey, when a court system, when a formal system says you need to stop this behavior, it actually discouraged them from continuing to engage in that behavior. So when we have a robust law enforcement response, when we are prepared to move forward in the criminal legal system, it can insulate the victim from the behavior overall, which is really the big win there, right? But it also can set us up for more reliable consequences, more reliable impacts, really helping us improve our prosecutorial response when we are looking at these stalking behaviors as a whole. So some big picture things to be thinking about, what policy do you have in place for your law enforcement agency? Thinking to screening cases, how we're assigning cases, so often within multiple agencies, but we'll see a lot of our intimate partner cases being tracked, being identified, being maybe handled totally separately from other types of cases, understandably so, again. But considering how victims of stalking, particularly if it's a stranger who's engaging in the stalking behavior or an acquaintance, right? Maybe somebody they go to school with, go to church with, they casually know. Are those cases being identified and being tracked and given the same level of attention within your system? How are we screening for those, right? And, inevitably, we're going to be covering a lot of partners here in the next little bit. So I'm probably going to be leaving you with some questions relative to your specific role. So if you have questions, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we clean up the policy? How do we have screening tools implemented within, the way that we do things? Please feel free to reach out. We're happy to help with anything that we can relative to your agency's response and improve. Okay. So that was my dramatic ending to the law enforcement section there. I just wanted to add some extra emphasis and to make sure you guys were all listening. So you all passed the test. Well done. But these are some resources that we have available on our site if you are interested in learning more about ways to improve our law enforcement response. All right, so let's jump into our prosecutorial partners. And I'm seeing someone said I'm freezing. I don't know. Is that for everybody?
You're not frozen for me.
Okay, I'm gonna keep rolling then. Don't play any more tricks on me, y'all, because I'm vulnerable to thinking I'm having some tech issues. All right, so our prosecutorial partners, here we go. We're going to roll into these. When we talk about prosecuting, oh, okay, Matthew, I appreciate the bad humor. I'll accept it and I will excuse it. When we talk about prosecuting these stalking cases, we really want to make sure that our prosecutor partners are equipped and ready to really charge and pursue these crimes with specificity. I'm going to say that because sometimes we see this deferment in general. This is a general statement, both within law enforcement and prosecutors, to pick out stalking and maybe charge harassment, right? Maybe have a hyper focus on a domestic violence charge that's co-occurring. We recognize that there are some real challenges to identifying stalking behaviors and charging those. They do require oftentimes a higher level of resource intensive responses and require, an intentional approach, as we've already discussed. But we really want to be thinking about how this can actually serve us from a prosecutorial stance, and ultimately the victim and survivor in the case is thinking about really the co-occurring crimes, recognizing when we can charge multiple crimes. When we are talking about domestic violence in particular, and I'm going to dig into this in just a bit, but this, even when we are charging domestic violence, we are charging that based on a single incident, right? Neighbors called, the police showed up, report gets taken, we're charging one of the individuals with domestic violence. We're limited as a prosecutor to that single incident, even though we as prosecutors and we as law enforcement and we as victim service advocates, right, we know that this abuse and we know what's going on here is way bigger than this single Saturday night. So when we do put that little bit of extra effort into identifying stalking behaviors, naming and charging stalking behaviors, it can be really helpful for us as prosecutors to think about the different tools that we need to respond to these cases, to support these victims, and to think about the ways that we are approaching kind of our preparation for these types of cases. So one thing I kind of point out when I talk about my own experience as a prosecutor, I worked as a prosecutor for a brief period of time in Tennessee. I was prosecuting domestic and sexual violence crimes primarily. I just remember feeling petrified about the Monday morning headlines, right? What case am I going to wake up to Monday morning? And I say Monday morning headlines, that dates me because this was before the 24-hour news cycle. But what case am I going to wake up to on Monday morning? And I'm going to see the person I just worked with, right? I'm going to see some horrible outcome that's happened in our community. And I'm going to think about the opportunity I just had with that person. I was so eager, really kind of desperate to have any tools or kind of indicators about what cases I should be paying attention to, what cases need a higher level of response, need a higher level of support. And so it can be helpful to our prosecutors to that end, though it does mean, hey, we're going to have a higher level of response, but it almost can reduce some of that stress and anxiety to say, hey, here are some indicators. Here are some things that we need to be paying attention to. But really, kind of from a big picture scale, is that when we require or when we charge stalking, we are opening up the ability as a prosecutor to tell a more complete story. So as I already mentioned, if we are just talking about the Saturday night, we are really limited to discussing the dynamics of the abusive behavior, the ongoing nature of the abusive behavior. Again, all of those things that we kind of inherently know as we do this work and as we are trained in this work, but we don't really get to tell a jury about that. We don't really get to tell the judge about that. We're really limited to that Saturday night for the most part. When we charge stalking, because it has that course of conduct, it opens up our window. It opens up the platform of what we can tell about this experience from the victim's perspective to really help either the judge or the jury get a firm understanding of this entire dynamic. It creates a much bigger runway for us in terms of telling a story and being impactful in the way that we tell the story. So I say that to, kind of encourage us from a prosecutor's perspective. Yes, we can look at kind of being equipped to charge stalking as a lift, but really if we flip that and we consider the kind of gift that it can give us, right? The advantage it can give us when we are dealing with specifically certain types of cases, we are going to see that the payoff is, really beneficial, and it's a really appropriate way to be addressing these behaviors and crimes in our community. So I'll just highlight really quickly some of the resources that we have on our site, but also our parent agency is Equitas, which is an agency that is made up all of former prosecutors who have extensive experience. So as you are working, maybe we've got prosecutors on the call, maybe you've got folks in your community, maybe you're going to go through this training today and you're going to try to bring your prosecutors along, right? Hey, y'all should be trained, or you should be kind of thinking about these crimes differently. If we're hitting roadblocks, if we're having difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out. We will certainly be happy to answer whatever questions we can and or kick it to our experts at Equitas to help you in the work that you're doing from a prosecutorial perspective. All right, so within the criminal legal realm, I do want to kind of highlight our pre and post adjudication supervision. So pre-adjudication supervision is going to be our pretrial supervisors, right? Folks who are providing oversight or monitoring case management for folks before they are adjudicated, before guilt is determined. These are folks who are pre-adjudication supervision is usually relative to them getting out of detention. And obviously our post-adjudication is going to be our probation or parole folks who will be providing case management or oversight to folks in the system. So ideally, within probation, and this applies to pretrial as well, we want to make sure that we are thinking through these stalking behaviors, that we're screening offenders. I've worked in a pretrial program, and there are oftentimes ways that we screen or categorize cases, and it's usually relative to the crime that is charged, which makes sense, right? Is this a crime that's relative to substance use? Is this a crime that's relative to physical violence, right? But really be thinking about, we talked already about all of the ways that stalking can actually be showing up in our criminal legal system. They might be charged with property damage, but really that underlying behavior is stalking. Thinking through the ways that we can better screen these cases so that we can supervise them appropriately. We do have some recommendations. We've got some kind of a model policy for our folks in the probation world relative to those supervision. A lot of times we're talking about specialized conditions, which I recognize, sometimes those are hard general recommendations to make. I feel like conditions of supervision can be very unique to a jurisdiction. It can be unique to an individual office, what resources you have available. It could be unique to the judge that you are in front of, right? What type of supervision conditions are available. But we just want you to think through, ways that we can improve and increase our supervision of these individuals, because we're going to talk about why in just a bit. But when we talk about high risk cases, individuals who are engaging in stalking behaviors are going to be really closely correlated with our high risk cases. So one of the things I always want to highlight, and I was doing a training last week for some of our pre and post adjudication supervisors, and we were talking about the opportunity to really engage stalkers, essentially, right? You are working with individuals who maybe are pre-adjudication, maybe post-adjudication, but you have the opportunity to build a rapport with them and build a relationship with them. We do see, when we look at some of the studies relative to the motivating factors behind stalking, we see some stalkers feel very entitled to their stalking behavior. They have no shame about their stalking behavior. They feel, that it's their right to engage in this behavior, to engage in this power control over another individual. So sometimes even structuring the conversation to hear from their perspective, it can be really helpful for us as, again, we're trying to kind of collect information, what's going on here, that we can improve our supervision of this person, get a good feel for where their mindset is and what their perspective is relative to this abuse. It's kind of a unique role within our criminal legal system, what our officers pre and post adjudication get to do, just something to be thinking about. This is a clip from our guide, our model guide that we have on our site, but these are some recommendations that we might have for our, probably a little bit more of our post-adjudication, but some of these could be incorporated into our pretrial supervision as well, but talking about those specialized caseloads. I really want to highlight for our pretrial folks the value, well, and post too, but pretrial maybe a little bit more relatively, the value of jail calls. If we have an individual who is in detention, if they are engaging in stalking behaviors, there is a high likelihood they will continue to engage in stalking behaviors on a recorded phone call from the jail. for some reason, and if you've done this work, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For some reason, the recording that tells the person, hey, this is being recorded and can be reviewed by law enforcement, does not dissuade these individuals from engaging in their stalking behavior. So again, if we're needing to collect information, if we're wanting to learn or assess the victim's safety, if we're wanting to kind of adequately categorize the risk that this individual poses, those jail calls can be really fruitful. I know they can be a little bit mind-numbing, maybe even sometimes a little entertaining, but they can actually give us a lot of information. I see someone joined in and said, I see it all the time, even text messaging on the jail tablets. Text messaging on the jail tablet was before my time, but yeah, I can imagine. They're using whatever forms and means of communication that they have to continue to engage in that abusive behavior. Again, just highlighting some of the resources that we have for our partners in this arena of our community, but don't overlook your pre and post adjudication folks. They are really important players to have at the table. They have a valuable insight to cases. They have valuable opportunity to engage and to intersect and to really promote victim safety. So make sure they are part of the conversation. All right, so let's look at the civil legal system. When we talk about the civil legal system, and I know the civil legal systems, that's a very broad category, right? Is thinking about where in the cycle of stalking we might see victims accessing this form of relief. And, again, this is kind of a generalization, but we see victims engaging the civil legal system at points of intimidation when those threats are occurring, right? Maybe the actual harm hasn't happened yet, but they've threatened to harm. And so we have victims who are accessing, maybe requesting petitioning for an order of protection. We see that life invasion sometimes can cause a victim to access the civil legal system. And in the same way, when we think about the civil side, we're thinking about family court, we're thinking about custody hearings, and even within our civil court, right? The lawsuits between two parties, sometimes that can be utilized. That really sometimes can be very weaponized by stalkers. We'll take a look at that in just a bit. But this is where we're seeing this intersection and opportunity for victims to be accessing help and really for our community to be responding. So again, when we think about who needs to be at the table of the CCR, who do we need to be having conversations with, don't overlook your civil legal partners. And that includes people like your clerks, right? Obviously, if you've got your legal aid partners, your folks who are assisting victims within that realm, those are really important people to have at the table, to be having these conversations with and to raise awareness with them. I really just briefly want to highlight kind of an emerging area of stalking behaviors, which is really kind of weaponizing the legal system as a whole. But we see the civil legal system becoming particularly vulnerable to this form of weaponization and abuse. But we see offenders who are, using the system to really harass, abuse, cause major damage in the victim's life. These are just kind of a couple of examples of ways that they can do this. In our response to this, there's not a perfect solution. Oh, this is how we keep this from happening within our system, but we have to be aware of it. We also cannot put our head in the sand and say, oh gosh, well, there's nothing we can do, so what's the point? There are things that we can do, and a lot of it is about intentionality and awareness. When we see someone who is abusing the legal system and having some kind of preemptive conversations and plans about structures that we will have in place or things that we want to be thinking about. So when I talk to our civil legal folks, particularly if they are representing victims in the civil legal system, there are some things I would like for them to be thinking about. These are just some general suggestions, before court. Some of it is some legal preparation, right? That we come in with the mindset, the objections to continuances doesn't seem overly shocking, but there is sometimes a kind of common practice that, hey, one party's going to ask for continuance, the other party's going to ask for continuance, and we everybody gets a turn asking for a continuance, right? Just being prepared as an attorney to shift the normal way of doing things. Yeah, we in a regular case, maybe we offer each other that professional courtesy, but in this case, I'm prepared to argue to the judge why this case should not be continued. Why a continuance is going to cause harm to my client. Making sure that we're protecting our clients from any type of abusive contact, and really that's kind of more relative to on the criminal legal side. We sometimes have defense attorneys who are reaching out to the victim. Hey, do you really want these charges to go through, right? You really want them to lose their job? You want them to spend time in jail? Making sure we're being intentional about building some insulation around that. thinking through all sources of testimony and really thinking about reducing that lift off the victim having to carry the entire story, right? Are there other people who have seen, who have heard, who have witnessed this abusive behavior? And how can we help use that to bolster the client's experience within the legal system? And really, the thing I would just say before court, I won't spend a ton of time on these, but just preparation. So, for those of us who have been in court all day, every day, 4 or 5 days a week, we become fluent in court, right? And not only do we become fluent in it, we become unaware of our fluency. We just kind of assume that everybody's going to know where to park. We assume everybody's going to know what it looks like or feels like to be in court. We assume everyone's going to know how long court's going to take. We assume all of these things, all of these parts of the experience, because it's become so normal for us. And the more that you can kind of break down any of the unknowns, whether it is transportation, where do you park? What door do you come in? What can you bring through security, right? If you break down any of those unknowns, it can really help reduce the anxiety and the stress that a victim might be feeling or facing before court. So that's just kind of my little plug out there, is sometimes being aware of that fluency and being aware of, the entire segment of the population who maybe has had no exposure to courtrooms or the way that things work inside the courthouse. During court, we want to think about logistical safety, insulation, and again, a lot of preemptive conversations with our court partners. If you can do that with your court officers, advocates, if you can partner with your victim service agencies to provide support for the victim, those can be really helpful for us to just not overexpose the victim to abusive behavior. I was training recently with one of our law enforcement consultants who worked stalking cases for many years, and she was kind of saying in general, stalkers do not miss court. Stalkers do not miss an opportunity to be in court because they know the victim has to be there, right? The court is giving them access to the victim, and they are going to take that opportunity every single time. So we want to be aware of that. There might not be a lot we can do to limit that, but we can help insulate the victim as much as possible in these court proceedings. And after court, the main takeaway, and this is really true for all 3 stages, but safety plan, right? Really thinking about the logistics of leaving court. Not only does the abuser get access to the victim in the courtroom, but now the stalker knows exactly where that victim is and where they're leaving from, right? So that physical access is really a crucial element to safety planning. Pre-court, too, they know that they're going to be coming in at a certain time, but certainly after court. I've heard from some jurisdictions who they have worked preemptively with their judicial official, and they just have a standardized policy in place that parties leave at different times, right? That they are being really intentional about the way that they treat these parties and helping create a safe opportunity for victims to leave, to be able to exit the court system without the likelihood that the offender or abuser is going to engage with them or cause them harm. All right, so let's talk through our victim advocates and our victim service world, right? Our partners within these worlds. Obviously, we know that our advocates play such a crucial role in providing the support that we need to help victims of stalking as they are engaging any forms of relief and or just navigating the abuse that they're experiencing. But this is a really important yet tragic data point relative to victims of stalking. I've already kind of alluded to this, but the majority of stalking victims do not even report or seek services. That's frustrating for us who want to help, right? We're like, hey, we want to help, we're prepared to help, we're here to help. And if nobody's asking us for help, sometimes we feel limited. But I hope we see this data point as an impetus to building the groundwork within our community, making sure that we are being intentional about our community response, being intentional about the way that we offer services, that the way that we engage victims, so that we can start to change the tide on this data point, right? And particularly when it comes to victim services, if you are a victim service agency, so many of the victim service agencies I have worked with are rooted in incredible grassroots movements, right, that came out of assisting and helping and rescuing is not really the right word, but supporting victims of domestic violence, right? That really is kind of the impetus of where that victim service movement came from in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is fantastic. It's wonderful. But what happens sometimes is those victim service agencies I certainly saw this a lot of times in small communities, but they kind of just get known as the domestic violence agency, right? And in fact, sometimes they even have names of, services that are kind of closely alluded to relational connection, my mother's house or my sister's keeper, right? And there's lots of good reasons why maybe they have those names. But my whole point here is we want to make sure our victim service agency makes it clear to victims of stalking who do not have a relational connection to their offender that they can get services. So, all that to say, here's my quick little audit you can do for your own community. If a victim of stranger stalking needs emergency housing in your community, is that available to them? That's the first question. And then the second question is, if you say, yeah, it's available, we have an emergency shelter, they will work with victims of stalking. Does the victim of stalking know that? Can they easily find that, right? Is there any messaging or communication on our victim service agency site that creates confusion or creates a barrier to that victim? So those are some things you can be thinking about, because that's really going to be helping us turn the tide, like I said, to that data point, particularly really hopefully helping encourage response and reporting relative to victims of stalking. So when we talk about victim service agencies, we know that they are engaging victims at that interference stage, right? When a harm has occurred, they oftentimes are accessing victim services for things like emergency shelter, or they've been referred because of their, case in the criminal legal system or in the civil legal system. Now, this is not, mutually exclusive. I know that victims could be coming to our agency at other stages in the stalking dynamic, but most often there's going to be some type of incident that brings them to our door. So when we are talking to victims of crime, when we are assessing, we are sometimes kind of hyper aware and hyper prepared to be identifying elements of domestic violence, maybe of sexual violence, maybe even of human trafficking, but really making sure that we're parceling out the stalking behaviors as well. This is kind of an additional lens that we need to have on when we are talking to victims about their experience and what they're going through. And to that end, when we talk to victims, we see sometimes this misunderstanding that stalking behaviors only occur after the breakup, right? I was dating this person, we broke up, didn't go well, now they're engaging in this really abusive stalking behavior. That might be true, but I would also argue if someone is engaging in abusive stalking behavior post-breakup, that means they had the ability, they had the I can't think of the word I'm trying to say. They've got the wiring, right? There's a high likelihood that they were engaging in abusive behavior before the breakup. So I have not worked very many cases where it was like, oh, a breakup suddenly made, yeah, thank you, Susan, capacity, suddenly made someone abusive, right? We recognize that these are behavioral dynamics that have probably been there under the surface before. So just making sure that we have that lens, that awareness that this might be occurring even if the person is still in a relationship with someone, or if they're describing, hey, this really escalated post breakup, that we're asking intentional questions to identify what might have been occurring during the relationship, right? Really making sure we're identifying that course of conduct. One of the reasons why we really want to identify stalking behaviors amidst all of these other co-occurring victimizations, particularly domestic violence, is because we know that the co-occurrence of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and stalking have some really serious indicators for our victims. We know that they pose the greatest risk to their victims. And had we not had a little power outage here, I'd give you an opportunity for you to tell me why you think they have posed the greatest risk to their victims, but it's really not a trick question, right? And there's a million answers to that question. But the short of it is because they know the most about their victim, right? They have knowledge about the victim. They know the victim's routine. They know the victim's relationships. They know what the victim's afraid of. They have historical kind of relationship with the victim, so they can send things like symbolic threats. They can send a dozen white roses and the victim knows exactly what they're saying without anybody else knowing. They know what apps the victim uses. They might even know what passwords the victim uses for their accounts. It just gives them greater access and greater ability to cause harm in that victim's life. So to that end, when we talk about intimate partner violence, particularly, so often we are utilizing the power and control wheel to think through all of the ways someone can engage in this abusive behavior. But if we really even start to kind of look at this power and control wheel with a different lens, we will see these stalking behaviors really kind of showing up in different places. We see this overlap of what we've kind of historically categorized just as abusive. We see an overlap between intimate partner violence and stalking. So really making sure, like I said, we are equipped to identify and kind of parcel out those dynamics as we are talking with victims. So similarly with sexual assault, sexual violence, we may overlook the stalking dynamic because we are responding to the incident of sexual violence, but in understanding how a stalker can utilize all of those stalking behaviors, right? The surveillance category specifically, gathering information about the victim for the purpose of causing sexual violence. They're gathering information like their routine, where they park, do they lock their back door, right? All those things that we talked about before, they are gathering that information for the purpose of being able to carry out sexual violence later against the victim. We do see occasionally stalkers that are soliciting kind of assaultive and abusive behavior from third parties, and they're doing that by impersonating the victim. They are using the information they've gathered about the victim to impersonate them and solicit that violence from third parties. But we also might see the stalking behaviors on the kind of the back end of the sexual violence. You better not tell anybody about what happened. Remember, I have those pictures of you, I have those videos, the threats, the invasive behavior, really exerting that power and control over the victim. We can see that kind of play out after the sexual assault has occurred. So again, kind of having broad perspective as we are engaging victims of different forms of abuse to identify when stalking could be showing up, if it's showing up within and co-occurring within that form of abuse. Relative to trafficking, kind of the short, my short summation, and I worked with victims of human trafficking for an extended period of time in East Tennessee. I cannot think of a single case of trafficking that I worked that did not have stalking behaviors co-occurring with it. And the best way that I can explain that is because when we are talking about human trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, we are talking about using another human as a product, right, for personal gain. So when we have trafficking and traffickers who are engaging in that, stalking is a really effective way to use a person and to control that person as a product. So we are going to see a high level of co-occurrence and kind of dynamics between those two forms of abuse. So for our advocates and our victim service agencies, we have some strategies and some recommendations that we offer on our site to help make sure that we are prepared to identify stalking, to respond to that specifically. And, this kind of runs the full gamut of not only identifying and screening for it effectively, but also maybe safety planning with some intentionality relative to stalking. So we have that all available on our site. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here, and I know I'm speed talking to make up for lost time here, but we're going to wrap up with why we need a CCR as a whole. Hopefully we've answered that question to some degree over the last hour or so, but just as a quick recap, right? And again, as you can kind of incorporate this into your own audit of your systems, is recognizing there are universal barriers to victims of stalking in their ability to access a response and access resources and support from our communities as a whole. So these are some general barriers that we see, and this might be kind of the areas that you dig into. Is this occurring in your community? Are these barriers present, right? That gives us kind of a good starting to-do list, a good starting checklist of the things that we need to be checking on and talking about and maybe improving, because we have to have everyone on the same page when we are talking about tackling this issue. It will not help if one boat is, risen higher than the others. We want to make sure that we are all ready and prepared to really recognize stalking and to respond to it with specificity. So to that end, and you'll see kind of a variation of these screening questions and all of the resources that we've highlighted, but making sure that we're screening for it effectively. And really the big picture takeaway I would say is when you are screening for stalking, that we are using behavioral language. We are asking about the actual behavior we're interested in, right? We can ask, are you a victim of stalking? We're probably not going to get high quality responses from that. If we ask about the actual behaviors we are interested in, we can really start to identify when stalking behaviors are actually occurring. To that end, when we talk about the harm, making sure that we are identifying the impact that it's having on the victim's life. So we can ask about the emotional impact. We can also ask about accommodations they've made in their life. We can talk about how this has disrupted their life and things, the way that this has changed their life, having to experience this abuse and survive this form of abusive behavior. I just want to highlight really briefly these risk factors in stalking cases, because these are important things for our community as a whole to be aware of, to understand that these are indicators of cases that have a likelihood to escalate. And when we talk about escalation, we see the emotional impact that these behaviors have on our victims. A vast majority of our victims have a real fear for their safety, for their physical safety moving forward, and thinking about having to navigate life just with truly being afraid of if you are going to be okay, if you're going to be physically safe, just the impact that can have. And unfortunately, the roll down of that data point is that stalkers do engage in physically invasive and violent behavior. So we see a correlation with stalking and dangerousness in our communities, threats with a weapon, property damage, threats, the explicit threats relative to the physical danger. We see all of those, the likelihood of all of those increase. And we know as responders, no matter what role we're in, what field we're in, we know as a whole, these are community indicators that we need to be paying attention to, and we have to be prepared to respond to. To that end, when we talk about intimate partner stalkers, we see a higher likelihood that these things will occur within that abusive dynamic. And one of the things I really want to point out that reoffend, that's particularly relevant to our pre-adjudication and post-adjudication partners, right? That's one of the things we're kind of keeping our eye on, is that we want to make sure that we don't have folks in our community who are a high likelihood to reoffend and cause harm to others or cause harm to our community. We also know that intimate partner stalkers have a high likelihood to harm third parties, to engage third parties in their abusive behavior. So this is all just kind of things we want to be aware of. We could dig into any one of these slides with more specificity through an entire training, but things we want to be aware of as a whole, as a community. These can be conversation starters as you are bringing your partners to the table, particularly if they're maybe hesitant, right? Why do we need to talk about stalking? Why is this something that we need to incorporate? We want to recognize that this is going to benefit our community as a whole. So you've heard me say this throughout all of the different arenas we've talked about today, but so much of it is about preventative work, right? Preemptive work on the front end, improving our policies and procedures. Don't wait until the house is on fire to decide how are we going to put out this house. Have a plan in place. Know what it's going to look like when we have stalking cases identified. Have those open conversations with your partners on the front end. So to that end, these are some recommendations that we have about a CCR that is stalking us kind of focused and wants to respond to the crime of stalking in our community. But I will say this, in a perfect world, you could have a stalking CCR, right? That has lots of time and opportunity to really dig into each of these elements and improve our responses. But I am going to bet that some of you on this call today do not have capacity for another meeting, another task force, another group to be part of. I'm gonna take a wild guess. That might be someone's reality on the call here today, and I totally understand that. What I would encourage you to do if you find yourself in that position is to use the structures you already have in place, the task forces that you're already on. Maybe you're already on a CCR for another dynamic, right? Maybe it's relative to intimate partner violence or sexual violence. Use the things that you have in place currently to start to introduce the conversation about stalking. Because as we've seen in the last hour or so, we are going to see an intersection, no matter what that task force is focused on, we're going to see stalking intersect with it in some way. And we can just start to kind of use these tools that we already have up and running to kind of increase the lens. If we are looking at, I mentioned earlier, a domestic violence fatality review team, right? Making sure that review team, if that's already up and running in your community, fantastic. Make sure they are looking and identifying stalking behaviors that happened in that victim's life prior to the homicide, right? That's just a way that we can expand what we're currently doing without adding a whole lot more lift or responsibility to our plates. So you've heard me say it over and over again, and I know that you know this as well. If you've done this work, if you've been in this field, you know that we have to have partnerships across the board. So we really recommend you taking this to your partners, having those conversations, encouraging them to get the training that they need, get the resources that they need, making sure that they feel equipped, prepared to respond to stalking cases that are coming to their door, regardless of where the victim is within that stalking dynamic. So you've seen me highlight several of those resources today. These are some other resources that we have available. And really the kind of little plug behind this is if you've got a partner who says, gee, I really want to do that, but I just can't. It's not possible for us to be able to do that, no matter what role they're in. Reach out to us because we might have a resource that can help with that, right? We might have ways that we can overcome whatever barriers that they're facing to really help them feel empowered to really respond to the crime of stalking. So I started with this, I'll end with it. This is our quick QR code to our site. You can log on there and find those resources and reach out to us. As I kind of mentioned on the front end, this is a high level kind of overview of stalking behaviors and how this is showing up for each of us individually within our professional roles, with the understanding though that all of these dynamics really we could dig into, and we have dug into with a lot of our training. So you can find a lot of our archive trainings on our site. You can go into those, or if there's an area that you think, man, we really need some help on safety planning, on risk assessment, on use of technology, feel free to reach out to us. We can either direct you to a recorded training or offer training for you and any other types of resources, or as I mentioned to you, technical assistance. If you've got a specific case that we can help talk through and assist you with, we're happy to do that as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Anything that we can do to help you. And on that note, I will thank you for committing an hour and 20 minutes now of your very valuable time. I have great appreciation for the work that you all are doing out in the field. And we are so grateful for partners like you who are willing to increase your knowledge, take on some new perspectives, and hopefully make some really meaningful change in your community. So and thank you for sticking with me through our little mini blackout there. And I'm going to see if we had any questions, or Emma, you can direct me to some if I've missed them. Oh, I do see a Q&A. Okay, so we did have a great question about engaging law enforcement, and I think this individual may have already jumped off the call today, but in the Q&A, we had a question that said, I'm imagining having a conversation about stalking with our local law enforcement and prosecutor who've been doing the work for a long time and have way more experience than I do. I don't want to come across as if I'm trying to teach them something, but I want to learn what they know and how they screen for stalking. I think that's a really great question, and one that's probably not unique, right? The diplomacy that goes behind building a CCR could be its own study and own training. It takes diplomacy, it takes some intentionality with relationship building. And some of that's going to be unique and subjective to your relationships and your role in the community. For me, what I find to be helpful, I think about it in kind of two different ways. One is kind of the micro way, the small scope way, which is any opportunity I have, if I'm engaging law enforcement or I'm maybe even trying to start a conversation with law enforcement as a whole, every time I'm engaging with them over donuts and coffee before the meeting starts, as we're working a case, whatever, anytime that's coming up, I'm asking really kind of curious questions, open-ended questions to help me learn more, but also to kind of put them on notice that I'm curious about it, right? How do you guys screen for stalking? What does that look like in the field? Do you guys have capacity to screen for stalking? How serious do you think this is in our community? Are you guys seeing stalking a lot, right? We can ask a lot of open-ended questions that can give us a lot of information and give us an opportunity to start a conversation, because we may have a disconnect there, right? We might have an officer who says, gosh, stalking never happens here. Really? That's interesting, because I've been reading these studies looking at the prevalence of it. It's hard to believe that our community is just an anomaly, that it's not happening here. It kind of makes me wonder if we're missing it, right? If we're not really identifying it every time we should. So that's kind of the micro level. And then the macro level is really talking to the folks who have the opportunity or have the ability to make kind of agency change. So, and again, that all kind of depends on your role and your relationship with folks, but talking to the folks who oversee policies and procedures. And when I am talking to individuals who have the ability to make big picture changes, I'm oftentimes talking about community outcomes. I'm talking about improving our system so we don't have individuals who have a high likelihood to reoffend in the community. Improving the system so we don't have individuals who have a high likelihood to harm others in the community, right? We're talking about outcomes, and we're talking about big picture, improving response and improving community safety as a whole. So those are kind of my two takeaways, but there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of conversation to be had there. Always happy to talk about that as well. Oh, see, John, I see you've added a series of stalking and harassment questions to our mandatory forms for DV cases in the San Francisco Police Department. That's awesome. I love to hear that. And I would love to hear too how that has changed the agency's recognition of stalking. Are our stalking cases going up, right? And it may take a little while for our data to reflect the changes, but I think that's really great. I love to see it. I'm a retired DP detective and now work for an advocacy organization. Advocacy centers should consider recruiting former LE. We talk the talk and can also do training for law enforcement. I do a lot of training in our area for law enforcement. Yeah, I think that's a really great recommendation. And I think what you're hitting at there at the talk, I was just doing a TA call yesterday with an advocate, and I was saying one of the hardest things with an advocate is when you are preparing and empowering a victim to access, help from law enforcement or help from prosecutors. You kind of have to prepare them with a law enforcement lens, right? Or with a prosecutor's lens, which really feels very different than maybe the way that we are engaging with the victim as an advocate. But you're so right, Brian. There's a real importance in being able to translate and being able to prepare and empower victims. It serves victims better when we can really prepare them for the systems and the reality of the systems, but also linking up that language and that conversation between those two agencies is crucial. I think that's a really great suggestion. Do we have any other questions? I know we've got about 5 minutes left. I just want to acknowledge I finished early with a blackout. So I think that goes down in Spark history here. Emma can document that and hold that for our agency. Yeah, so we used to have some recognition and some acknowledgement of Brian's idea about former law enforcement really helping link the bridge there between advocacy and our law enforcement partners. And I agree with you. Even as I train law enforcement, I love to have our law enforcement consultants do that with me because I know law enforcement likes to hear from law enforcement. So there is real value sometimes in having folks who have worn the badge, so to speak, be part of that conversation. Any other questions? I know your time is valuable. We won't just hold it here in perpetuity here. Candy's great. If I could create some way to throw out virtual candy on my trainings, I absolutely would, because I agree with you. Very effective. Issues with judges and prosecutors asking where is the death threat and dealing with pattern conduct stalking case. It drives me nuts. Yeah, John, I think I would love to chat with you kind of individually about that relative to the stalking statute that you're dealing with in whatever jurisdiction you might be in. I think sometimes there can be a hyper focus on the impact or the nature of the behavior. What I hear sometimes is prosecutors or judges being hesitant to pick up a case if it doesn't have that extreme impact. What I really like to do when I have that kind of mentality is, I'm old school, so it oftentimes is like a legal pad, but really just like bringing a legal pad and breaking out the statute to say, here's what I'm seeing the statute say, like here's what's required for this crime to be recognized and to be charged. And here's the evidence, here's what, the victim is offering. Why are we not charging it? Really getting a clarification on how the statute is not translating to the victim's experience rather than kind of that form and practice. Because we kind of hear sometimes that this is the way we've always done things, or this is just the way that we handle things, which is understandable, but we want to think about, trying to help push back on that when we can, or just open up those lines of communication as well. Yeah, Evelyn, you recommended about bringing up cases, stalkings and homicides. Sometimes that can be an impactful way to start the conversation too. And I don't mean that callously by any means, but saying like, this was a real mistake that's happened in our community. How can we learn from this? And what does that look like? Let's see. We've got some folks chatting here. All right. So it looks like, John, you're in California, I think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we've got very different laws. Yeah. And I'm assuming very different elements to those laws, but I would be interested to kind of dig into those statutes with some specificity to see what that looks like. It looks like, yeah, someone else had worked with a victim who had kind of the same outcome with law enforcement, that they were lacking that death threat. I think that can be a lot of conversations and pushback, but also I'll kind of be curious if it's a matter of education about, these stalking behaviors. The overt death threat doesn't have to be there for there to be indicators of lethality or indicators of physical harm. And so maybe that can be a beneficial way to start to kind of, tackle that problem as well. Heather, you're asking about assessments and stalking. You also got bumped off. So welcome to the club. I know Emma may have linked at one point some resources that we've had. We do have some stalking assessment resources. It kind of depends on the professional role that you're in, but I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're alluding to, if there was another comment that came through. Oh, okay. Looks like somebody else has got that information for you. There you go. Thank you, Emma. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I'll hang out here for the next minute or so if anybody else has any questions or anything else I can do to help support the work that you're doing. But thank you guys for logging on. I hope you guys have a really great Tuesday.